This is distributed leadership as work design, retrofitting the job characteristic models by Merowitz et al. This is Group C, Denise Reynolds, Trinidad Ramkisson, and Monet Rivers. And we'll be presenting this distributed leadership as work design. In distributed leadership as work design, Marowitz argues that distributed leadership should be understood not simply as a descriptive lens, but as a form of organizational work redesign. This is framing, this framing is significant because it shifts the conversation from abstract theory to structural change in educators' daily work.
Mm. And this slide right
Wow.
here essentially talks about where Merowitz kind of revived this model. And it initially was from Hackman and Oham's job characteristic model. So we have two figures here. We have the first figure for the original model, and then there's some key differences that we'll talk about a little later in our presentation.
Okay, so Merowitz revived Hackman and Ullman's job characteristic module and adapted it to schools by expanding both the transition mechanism and contextual variables that influence success. He stated that teachers must start to conceive of their roles differently and must assume responsibilities beyond their classrooms for purpose of overall school improvement.
Here you'll see
And
the characteristics of redesigned work. Under distributed leadership, educators experience change in five core areas, which would be skill variety, task significance, task identity, autonomy with balance with interdependence, and feedback.
Okay, so he looked at the fact that one major contribution that he made to the article is expanding JCM model beyond motivation. And so he argues that motivation is limited explanatory power. So he added sense making and learning. And sense making is especially critical in times of change. Distributed leadership requires collective interpretation of how things will be around here. And this is from page 83 of his article. And without sharing meaning, redesign work may generate stress rather than growth. And this is what he's saying about teachers now taking ownership of what's
Mhm.
happening in the building. um, he also talked about learning. Learning is equally central. Educators must develop the capacity to perform leadership functions effectively, not simply feel motivated to do so. Because they are learning new skills and adapting to these new skills, then they are able to own what is taking place within their school.
And this is a review of the performance leadership function outcomes. And so essentially, it's concentrated into six interconnected macro functions, shifting from leadership position to practice. And you have providing and selling a vision, providing encouragement and recognition, obtaining resources, adapting standard operating procedures, monitoring the improvement effort, and handling disturbances. Critical caution on outcomes: the relationship between distributed leadership and school improvement remains underdeveloped. While many assume positive outcomes, there is very little evidence that demonstrates a causal connection between multiple leadership function performance and school improvement.
And this is something that he said that we need to be very careful of, because it's moving from leadership is shifting from just a position to a practice. So we
Mhm.
have to be very careful on how we see this, because sometimes the outcomes that we expect, we will not see it right there and then. It's going to take a while.
I think a lot of that has to do with how people provided practice in this. So,
Yeah,
mhm.
and then it goes back to that initial model where it's more individualistic when we talk about motivation, and then it transitions to more structural and system wide and looking at the whole picture in the school system. And so that's how you can see it kind of manifest.
Yeah. Organizational antecedents and moderators. The model also includes 5 contextual conditions, and those conditions are organizational structure, organizational and professional culture, relational trust, excuse me, micropolitics, organizational stability. And so in relational trust, you have that trust is particularly central. It serves as both glue and lubricant in organizational life from page 89. And without trust, feedback loops weaken and collaborative leadership fractures. We also
Mhm.
want to understand that organizational stability, especially the principal stability, is crucial. Therefore, the authors conclude that the robustness and validity of, I'm sorry, the viability of distributed
Viability, yeah.
viability, sorry,
Yeah.
of distributed leadership is dependent on the support and direction of the principal.
So,
But we should also be cautioned that it would be naive to ignore major structural, cultural, and micro-political barriers operating in schools that make distributed forms of leadership difficult to implement.
right. So the article looks at growth-oriented change and the fact that what we have here is that meaningfulness, I'm not seeing the title, sorry. Meaningfulness, task identity, increase skill variety are all professional growth and internal motivation. And it leads to a positive effect gain and behavioral change and performance of leadership function. They also caution us that previous redesigns efforts often produce effective gains without corresponding behavioral change. So what he's basically saying is that in order for you to grow professionally, you must be able to correspond this with your behavior changing. And all of this will eventually lead to school improvement outcome. Another evidence linking multiple leadership performance to improve outcomes remains limited. Therefore, connection is tentative. And so growth-oriented change can actually happen, but it must be related to the person who is involved in the leadership position willing to change their behavior. So, growth-oriented change example. I am a part of the ILT, so I'm going to look at it in the lens of ILT. So, according to the author, the authors, distributed leadership expands educators' work by increasing skill, variety, and requiring educators to develop new collaborative and leadership skills. And when we're looking at it from the ILT position, we on the ILT team, we develop professional meetings and we teach teachers how to improve their practices. Teacher leaders gain experience facilitating learning among each other, and administrators gain deeper insight into what's happening within the classroom. One of the professional development that we had, sessions that we had, we were looking at the analytic, holistic, and single criteria rubrics, where we were helping teachers to figure out how to do feedback, a turnaround feedback within the classroom. So growth-oriented change A second example of growth-oriented change. Why is my screen like this? I'm sorry. Technical difficulties.
Bear with us, bear with us.
Let me see if I can minimize this. Right. So a second example of growth occurs through the development of a broader system level perspective among teachers through ILT participation. Teacher leaders become involved in activities such as aligning classroom instruction with the instructional leadership, framework, and evaluating progress towards school-wide goals. This reflects the concept of task identity in the distributed leadership model that the author was talking about, where educators see how their work contributes to the larger mission of the school, instead of focusing solely on their individual classrooms. So therefore, we, the ILT members, help shape instructional priorities and guide improvement strategies across departments and grade levels. A third example of growth-oriented change is the strengthening of feedback loops and information flow within the organization. As within our ILT meetings, we provide regular opportunities for teachers, coaches, and administrators to share classroom observations, student work samples, and instructional data. These conversations allow educators to engage in collective problem solving and continuous learning. So according to Meyerowitz model, these types of feedback process support the transition mechanism of learning and sense making, which help educators understand how new leadership responsibility contribute to school improvement as information flows between the classrooms and the leadership teams. And school is better able to adapt to instructional practices and response to students' needs.
So distributed leadership and social justice and equity. You can see that distributed leadership has potential to advance equity by surfacing diverse perspectives, distributing power to marginalized voices, and aligning local practices with equity goals. And then when decision making includes, it's most affected by inequities like teachers, students, and families, policies and instructional moves can better attend to differential needs. But some limitations are if existing power hierarchies are unexamined, distribution can reproduce inequities, tokenizing voices without shifting influence or resources. And I'm sure we see that a lot in all of our schools. So as this illustration demonstrates, the micro-political perspective offers an insightful alternatives to the rational structural perspective as it removes the assumption that administrator controls is legitimate. With a micro-political lens, schools are viewed as arenas of struggle where self-interested power, conflict, alliance, and ideology are all in play. And once again, we've all seen that in our school buildings. So intentionally structured participation, who includes how decisions are made, how resources are allocated, paired distributed roles with equity-focused norms, data practices, and accountability structures. So basically, all of the teams or all of the resources that are in the school and without the school need to come together to a cohesive unit. So some examples of that could be redistributing decision authority to marginalized voices by rotating school improvement teams, document decisions, and assign follow-up tasks. Another example is collaborative curriculum co-design for culturally relevant instruction. And this could be done by establishing cross-role design workshops, follow stepwise agendas, identify biases, and propose alternative prototypes and pilots, and then to ensure shared responsibilities for equitable content and assessment. And one more example would be a shared data inquiry to address opportunity gaps. And here you'll be analyzing whatever data, you know what I'm talking about. Identify inequities, ensure transparencies, and publish the results. Assign and monitor tasks and design targeted interventions. And I think that the biggest issue here that we see in schools that the results are not transparent. It's often not provided to all the work that you've done, and you can't it doesn't transcend, it doesn't turn over because you don't know
Mhm.
what you're doing, you don't know what's good, and you don't know what's bad. So I think that we see that also in our schools. So crafting coherence, we can facilitate more open and democratic decision-making processes. Teachers or other members bring their agendas together with those of administrators and external forces. Page 81.
And when we think about ethical and moral considerations, these are the three kind of buckets that the author puts forth: trust, vulnerability, and competence, micro politics, arenas of struggle, ethical questions, authority specifically, and responsibility. And when we think about distributive leadership, that can't happen if there aren't ethical and moral considerations. And so when we go to the next slide, I'll talk about some specific examples where we could see that happen. But before so, I just wanted to touch on in the article, the author reframes ethical responsibility as a collective rather than a solely the principal's burden. So shifting again from that specific position again to now practice. Now it's a whole group mindset. And then multiple actors being bring varied ethical perspectives, which are really important, and it can help when it comes to coding, collaboration, and reflection. And then establishing explicit ethical protocols, decision rules, and shared accountability agreements are really, really important so that it can actually have transparency and everyone can be on the same page. And I'll touch on that um, in our next couple of slides. Some limitations to consider is that the diffusion of responsibility can kind of blur accountability. So again, it's really important to be specific and make sure that everyone's on the same page so that we're not having a fractured vision. And a quote that exemplifies this is: "For purposes of elaborating our distributive leadership model, we note that both of these two elements, powerful structures in political interactions, particularly in the form of conflict, can influence the redesign of work and its transition into leadership function performance." And so ethical and moral considerations being at the forefront is really important. And the foundation is to have trust relationships. And the consequence of not having a trustful relationship is that in schools where faculty felt they were falling out of a trust zone, a steering committee of influential teachers lost its ability to sustain a unifying vision for school improvement. And that was on page 90. Trust relationships among teachers and between principals and their peers may be the most important. And now to a couple examples for how to execute that in a school setting or any setting for that matter. Implementing equity and fairness in leadership opportunities. And that can be achieved by creating a transparent list of roles so that everyone's aware of it, inviting open participation, making sure that not only seasoned teachers are aware of these opportunities, but newer teachers, because again, we're all sharing the responsibility. It's not supposed to be limited to a small group. And then that also speaks to the implementation of a rotation system where it can either happen annually or it can happen by semester or quarter. And this again prevents the concentration of power and having a lot of this decision making being decided in silos.
Right, because in my school, what happened is every year we have different members of the ILT, different members of the SDC, and different members of the SLT teams.
I love that. And then implementing another example would be implementing accountability and responsibility in distributive leadership. So again, defining clear leadership roles, making sure that everyone knows that there's a team leader, there's someone that's going to conduct the data, there's someone that's going to be taking the note taken. That then ensures everyone's on the same page and we're not like, wait, this didn't happen. Wait, you're supposed to do that. Or wait, why didn't this happen? There's really clear parameters around work expectation. Establish a shared goal aligned with mission. It can be really easy for people to lead with ego, and a way to combat that is by saying, hey, we're going to focus on the school. We're going to focus on the mission. We're going to focus on student success so that we don't have that compete. And that can kind of create the conflict that can really be counterproductive to this pursuit of a shared practice.
Agreed.
Three, yeah, right. Like, wait a minute, what are we
Yeah,
talking about? That's not the
right.
agenda we're on, right?
Yep.
And then create measurable action plans. By doing this, it normalizes that, we are checking in constantly. So no one feels micromanaged. No one feels like, hey, someone is telling me how I need to do my job. Everyone is going through this process, and it can identify holes, or it can say, hey, this is the things that we're doing really well that we want to continue to incorporate moving forward. And that goes to the fourth one again, using that regular progress monitoring, which is really important. And the last example is implementing respect for professional voice and collaboration. Personally, this does not reflect our group, but I think this is the most important one. None of this work can happen if there isn't trust. And so, first you have to establish norms for respectful communication. Everyone needs to be on the same page. There has to be buy-in, because if anyone feels disrespected, they're going to feel like, wait, I'm no longer bought into this work. And that then ties into the psychological safety that can be encouraged by school leaders in telling people, hey, we want to hear your thoughts. We want to hear your feedback, and being explicit that there isn't going to be any consequence as a result of people giving that feedback, and then act on it. Finally, you got to act on it. There's nothing more frustrating than spending so much time doing research, um, doing professional development, and coming back to your school community and saying, hey, this is what we should do. This is how it's going to serve our community. And then someone says, yeah, we'll do it. And nothing happens. So actually find a normalization of, okay, let's try this. Let's this be our goal for the next year. I think those are important things to ensure that ethical and moral considerations are intact, to ensure that distributed leadership is successfully implemented in a school.
So just from some feedback and and information flow, distributed leadership and collective inquiry increases opportunity for collective and communication, inquiry and communication. Feedback roles, it's not merely evaluative, it activates learning and supports sense making. And then it provides high trust, functions as organizational glue and lubricant, strengthening cohesion and efficiency. And then low trust and micro political pressure, and then your feedback loops may collapse. So again, if you don't have that feedback and that information flow, on the top, I mean, on the bottom is what you get. But if you provide those feedbacks and the information flow, you get the high trust and you get that glue, you get that cohesiveness that really makes the distributed leadership function well. So here you'll see that the system was improved by using the Merowitz distributed leadership model. Again, so it's really about just having that shared leadership and the collaboration of school improvement. Whereas on the old model, you have all these different frameworks, and they don't always necessarily come together as one. It remains as its separate own entities, you could say. And again, with the leadership model with Merowitz, it exemplifies distributed leadership by intentionally sharing work among multiple educators and not centralizing a single role.
So one implication for the broader educational leadership field is that leadership teams, for example, like the ILTs, can strengthen organization learning by leadership teams like ILT, giving the opportunity to educators to analyze instructional practice and student outcomes together. Also, the fact that there is a flow with information between the principal and the teachers. Also, the fact that they're, rather than relying on a top-down communication, distributed leadership structure encourage information to flow, leadership priority shape instructional practices, and of course, classroom insights inform leadership decisions, and leadership priority shape instructional practice. And so what we will have, because of this model that the author is talking about, is a shared responsibility. So because there's a shared responsibility, what will happen is the outcome would be better for the school and the organization. Student learning outcomes would improve. Also, teacher retention will improve because now teachers are making sense of their job. And then you have principals not being micromanaging the staff members, and staff members feel free to express themselves on how they would love to improve the school.
And improving the system, sustainability through distributed leadership, feeds into maintaining instructional coherence and then ultimately building a broader shift in educational leadership as described in this graphic.
And finally, key takeaways for leaders. It's this function is not superficial when we are implementing it, because if you implement it in a superficial way, you are not going to get the result that you should get. So you have to be intentional in your structural redesign. You must have a stable leadership, strong relational trust. You must put attention to micropolitics, and therefore this would be successful in implementing a framework for structural change. Of course, this new redesign, it requires educators to work together. It depends heavily on the contextual conditions within the school. So if you're not willing to work with your principal and willing to work with members within your school, it's really not going to change the school or improve the school. It demands learning and sense making beyond motivation, and it does not automatically produce school improvement. You will see it over a period of time. Thank you.
Those are those growing pains. Okay.
Thank you all so much.
Yes, thank you.